The bright glow of the CNN studio lights bathed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in a warm radiance that made the deep maroon of her tailored suit gleam like armor. Every camera in the room pointed at her, lenses gleaming, capturing the image of a woman standing on the edge of a defining moment in her career. She knew the stakes, not just for her reputation, but for the ideals she had fought for long before she set foot in Congress. Across the stage, Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard law legend, adjusted his glasses and gripped a thick stack of papers. He was every inch the establishment's champion. Silver hair neatly combed, suit immaculate, voice dripping with the self-assured confidence of a man who had once shaped American constitutional debate itself. "I've got evidence," he told the moderator with the satisfaction of a prosecutor about to deliver a knockout blow. "Evidence that will expose the Congresswoman's complete lack of legal understanding." The audience stirred. Phone cameras rose like a sea of glowing eyes. The crowd knew what was coming. A battle between generations, between theory and reality, between an old lion of the legal world and a rising star who refused to be underestimated. Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on her notes. Her eyes, calm, sharp, and utterly focused, locked on the man who had just publicly dismissed her expertise. She'd faced this before. Older lawyers, mostly men, who mistook her composure for weakness and her courtesy for naivete. What they never expected was how thoroughly she prepared, or how decisively she struck when the moment came. Tonight, Alan Dershowitz was about to learn that lesson the hard way. CNN host Rebecca Mitchell turned to face the camera, her polished voice slicing through the hum of anticipation. "Good evening, and welcome to America Debates. Tonight, a special discussion on the proposed Voting Rights Protection Act. Joining us, Professor Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law Emeritus and one of the nation's most prominent legal voices, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas, former public defender and civil rights attorney." A polite round of applause followed. The tension, though, was already electric. Dershowitz straightened in his chair. "Thank you, Rebecca. I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born, and I think viewers deserve to hear from someone who actually understands the legal complexities involved." It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. The comment landed like a gauntlet thrown. Crockett's smile was faint, but knowing. Her gold necklace caught the light as she leaned forward slightly. "Good evening. I'm here not to lecture from an ivory tower, but to discuss how this legislation affects real people, voters I've represented in court, and communities I now represent in Congress." Rebecca glanced between them. "Let's begin with the basics. Professor, you've called this bill unconstitutional. Congresswoman, you're a co-sponsor. What's at stake?" Dershowitz didn't hesitate. What's at stake is the constitutional balance of power. This bill represents a blatant federal overreach into state-controlled elections. It's not only bad policy, it's unconstitutional. Frankly, I'm surprised someone with a law degree would support it. The audience gave a collective murmur, part shock, part intrigue. Crockett didn't look rattled. If anything, her expression softened, almost amused. "Professor, you seem to believe constitutional interpretation is the exclusive privilege of professors. It isn't. It belongs to every American whose rights are affected by these laws." Dershowitz blinked, a flicker of surprise at her tone. She continued, voice clear, deliberate. "Article 1, Section 4 gives Congress power to regulate federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments explicitly authorize Congress to protect voting rights. That's not radical theory. That's the text." Dershowitz's smile tightened. "Congresswoman, I'm well aware of those provisions, but the Supreme Court, particularly in Shelby County versus Holder, reaffirmed state sovereignty in elections. Congress can't micromanage states." "I'm familiar with Shelby County," Crockett replied. "I've litigated cases affected by it. The issue isn't state authority. It's whether that authority is being used to suppress voters. That's the kind of emotional, non-legal rhetoric that clouds real debate," Dershowitz said sharply. "The Constitution guarantees equal protection, not convenience. And when restrictions disproportionately disenfranchise certain communities," Crockett replied, That's not convenience, Professor. That's a violation of equal protection itself. The crowd reacted audibly. Rebecca raised a hand to restore order. Let's turn to specifics, she said. Professor, you've criticized the bill's requirement for minimum early voting days. Why? This is federal overreach, Dershowitz said firmly. States vary in population and resources. Forcing uniform standards is chaos waiting to happen. I've got statements from election administrators in 17 states warning this would be unworkable. Crockett calmly opened a folder and held up a document. Interesting, she said, because I have statements from election officials in 23 states, including Republican ones, saying the opposite. They support these standards as both achievable and necessary. Dershowitz's jaw stiffened, but she wasn't finished. And since you like quoting experts, she continued, let's quote you. In your 1982 book, Rights of the People, you wrote, and I quote, federal voting standards may be necessary when states demonstrate persistent discrimination or administrative failure. You specifically called for national early voting standards. Has the Constitution changed since then, Professor, or just your position? The studio fell quiet. Academic thinking evolves, he managed. The voting landscape has changed. So constitutional interpretation changes based on politics now? She asked. That's an interesting take for someone who calls himself an originalist. Rebecca stepped in. Let's move to voter ID laws. Critics say this bill weakens election integrity by limiting ID requirements, she prompted. Those critics ignore the data, Crockett answered. Multiple studies show voter fraud is practically non-existent. But what's very real is that roughly 25 million Americans lack the IDs some states now require. With all due respect, the Brennan Center isn't unbiased, Dershowitz countered. And the idea that millions can't obtain an ID? That's frankly insulting. Crockett's expression hardened. Have you ever represented a client who lost their right to vote because they couldn't afford documentation? I have. Have you met elderly voters born through midwives with no birth certificates? I have. Have you spoken with working-class Americans who can't take time off during ID office hours? I have. Dismissing those realities is the very definition of ivory tower detachment. Even Rebecca blinked. Crockett's composure was magnetic. Personal anecdotes, however moving, don't override constitutional principles, Dershowitz said. States must ensure election integrity. The Supreme Court has upheld ID laws. Yes, in Crawford versus Marion County, Crockett replied. But even in that ruling, the court emphasized the lack of evidence showing real burdens. When evidence does exist, as it does now, the analysis changes. And speaking of selective evidence, in your 2005 Harvard Law Review article, you accused judges of hiding political bias behind constitutional reasoning. You used voter ID laws as your example. That's out of context, he said quickly. Would you like me to read the full paragraph? She asked. I have it right here, Rebecca cut in. We'll pause right there. We'll take a short break, and when we return, we'll continue this powerful exchange. As the red light on the cameras blinked off, the tension didn't fade. Dershowitz leaned toward his aide, whispering sharply, flipping through his notes. Across from him, Crockett calmly sipped water, posture straight, demeanor unbothered. When a producer asked if she needed anything, she smiled lightly. No, thank you. But you might want to check on the professor. We haven't even reached the contradictions yet. When the cameras came back on, Dershowitz was ready to strike again, or at least he tried to be. I've reviewed my statements, he began confidently. My position has always been consistent. Balance access with integrity. That's what states are doing. And with all due respect, Congresswoman, this isn't about passion. It's about experience. I've argued before the Supreme Court over 50 times. I've taught constitutional law to generations of lawyers. Your background as a freshman Congresswoman hardly qualifies you to lecture me. A ripple ran through the audience. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. Crockett's expression changed, subtle, deliberate. Professor, she said, her voice taking on a courtroom clarity, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. By all means, he said. The elephant, she said slowly, is that you rely on credentials instead of substance. That may work in your lecture hall, but this isn't Harvard Law, and I'm not your student." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "I am addressing substance," he shot back. "You're the one quoting decades-old texts." "I'm highlighting your inconsistency," she countered. "Let's talk about recent history. In December 2020, you argued that state legislatures couldn't even be bound by their own constitutions when choosing presidential electors, a stance that would have nullified millions of votes. How do you reconcile that with your supposed defense of state sovereignty now? That was a specific argument about the electors clause, entirely different context." "Is it?" she pressed. "Because both deal with the same constitutional principle, federalism balanced with voting rights. But your interpretations seem to shift, depending on whose power it serves." A murmur swept the studio. Even Rebecca leaned forward. "That's outrageous," Dershowitz barked. "My analysis is grounded in constitutional law, not politics." "Then let's test that," Crockett said, calm again. "You cite Shelby County versus Holder as limiting federal oversight, but Chief Justice Roberts himself affirmed Congress's ongoing authority to address discrimination. Our bill does exactly that. I've represented clients hurt by the aftermath of that decision. I've seen polling places close, voters purged, IDs weaponized. This isn't theory. It's people." He opened his mouth, but she raised her hand. "I listened to you respectfully. Please extend the same courtesy." And for the first time, the old professor went silent. Crockett's tone was steady, precise. "You've argued before the court. I've argued before judges who decide whether my clients could vote at all. Constitutional theory matters most when it meets lived reality." Rebecca turned to her. "So what's your defense of this bill in one line, Congresswoman?" "This isn't about federal takeover," Crockett said, holding up the document. "It's about ensuring minimum protections. States retain flexibility, but no American's right to vote should depend on their zip code." "Professor, your response?" Rebecca asked. "The Congresswoman's experiences are compelling," he said, "but the Constitution delegates election authority primarily to the states. This bill micromanages 42 specific mandates in Section 306 alone." "I'm glad you brought up Section 306, Crockett said. "That section is based on a 1991 proposal you endorsed in your own congressional testimony, where you called similar provisions, appropriately, tailored federal interventions. I have the transcript if you'd like to refresh your memory." The studio fell silent again. Crockett slid a copy of the transcript toward him. "Page 12, she added gently. The camera zoomed in as Dershowitz's eyes scanned the paper, his confident posture collapsing into unease. The quote was real, and it was damning. Crockett faced the camera directly. "This debate isn't just about law. It's about integrity, not just of elections, but of arguments. When legal scholars reverse their own principles for political convenience, it undermines faith in the very system we claim to defend." Rebecca looked stunned. "We'll have to pause right there," she said softly. "When we return, audience questions for both guests." As the lights dimmed for commercial break, a producer whispered to another, "We just caught lightning on live TV." And across social media, hashtags were already exploding. Sir Crockett vs. Dershowitz. The new voice. Wrong section 502. The night wasn't over, but the tide had already turned. The red light blinked back on. The commercial break was over. The hum of the studio returned, softer now, as if everyone sensed something irreversible had already happened. Rebecca Mitchell's voice steadied the transition. "Welcome back to America Debates." Before the break, we witnessed a spirited exchange between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Professor Alan Dershowitz on the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Protection Act. We now turn to questions from our studio audience. The camera panned across faces glowing under the lights. Students, legal scholars, activists, everyday voters. The energy was raw, unfiltered, buzzing like static before a storm. A young man in a navy sweatshirt stood. "This question is for Professor Dershowitz. You've argued for decades that constitutional interpretation should be guided by principle, not politics. But when you dismiss the Congresswoman's arguments as emotional, isn't that politics in disguise? The question cut clean. Even Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Dershowitz shifted in his seat. "No, that's not politics," he said, trying for composure. "That's experience. Legal debates demand rationality. I'm critiquing her reasoning, not her temperament." Crockett tilted her head, her voice soft but firm. "With respect, Professor, when men label women's arguments emotional, it's often a way to avoid addressing the substance. I've heard it my entire career, from courtrooms to Congress. It's a form of dismissal disguised as sophistication." The audience broke into applause. Dershowitz's jaw tightened. Rebecca moved quickly to the next question. "From the third row, please." A woman in a gray blazer stood. "Congresswoman Crockett, how do you stay composed when someone questions your credentials or tries to discredit your expertise?" Crockett smiled faintly. "You learn not to react to disrespect with anger," she said. "You respond with receipts." "Because facts don't flinch." Laughter and clapping rolled through the studio. Even Rebecca couldn't help but smile. Dershowitz leaned toward his microphone. "I've debated presidents, senators, and judges. I don't question her right to speak. I question her understanding of the document she swore to uphold. And I've defended that document in courtrooms that didn't have cameras or microphones," Crockett replied. "Places where it wasn't about prestige, but about people who'd lost their rights." Her tone was razor-sharp but steady, and the crowd went quiet again. Rebecca interjected before the moment could spiral. "Final question. Both of you, how do we restore trust in the system?" Crockett answered first, "By making sure every citizen's voice matters equally. Not by suppressing votes, not by rewriting history, but by expanding the promise of democracy to those who've never fully had it." Dershowitz followed, his tone clipped. "By protecting constitutional integrity, our system depends on limits, on ensuring that passion doesn't override process. When Congress oversteps, chaos follows. Two philosophies, two Americas, facing each other under one spotlight." Rebecca nodded to the camera. "When we come back, we'll hear closing statements from both guests." The lights dimmed again. The crew swarmed around them, adjusting makeup, mics, papers. Crockett remained still, her gaze distant but calm. Her phone vibrated once. A text from her communications aide flashed on the screen. "You're trending. Every clip's gone viral. Fox, MSNBC, even BBC running it live." Another message came seconds later. "You just won the internet." She exhaled quietly. None of this had been planned as a personal victory. She'd only wanted the truth to cut through the noise, but it was too late. This had become a moment. Across the table, Dershowitz's assistant leaned down. "Professor, social media's framing this as a loss. We can fix it later, maybe an op-ed." "Enough," he hissed, waving her off. His hands trembled slightly as he restacked his notes. The red light came back on. The closing segment had begun. Rebecca's voice was even. "Professor Dershowitz, your closing statement." He cleared his throat. "The Constitution was designed to restrain power, not enable it. Good intentions don't justify bad law. We cannot allow Congress to dictate every detail of elections. Once we surrender that autonomy, we surrender our balance of power." He leaned back, visibly fatigued. "History will judge us by whether we preserve the structure that made democracy possible." Rebecca nodded. "Congresswoman Crockett?" Crockett took a moment before speaking. Her eyes swept the room. The cameras, the faces, the quiet that had settled into something reverent. "Professor Dershowitz says the Constitution restrains power. I agree. But it also empowers justice. It was amended after slavery. It was amended for women. It was amended for equality. Each time, Congress used that same Constitution to expand rights, not shrink them." Her tone deepened. "This bill isn't about control. It's about protection. Because the right to vote isn't a privilege granted by states, it's a promise guaranteed by the Constitution itself. And if defending that promise makes me emotional, then maybe this country needs a little more emotion in its justice." The crowd erupted. Applause so loud the audio meters spiked red. Rebecca looked momentarily overwhelmed but recovered quickly. "Thank you, Congresswoman." "Thank you, Professor." That concludes tonight's debate. The broadcast ended, but no one in the studio moved. Crockett stood, gathered her notes, and extended her hand across the table. Dershowitz hesitated, then took it. Her grip was firm, professional, unwavering. "You argued well," he said quietly, almost grudgingly. "So did you," she replied. "We just come from different corners of the same Constitution." He gave a thin smile. "Maybe so. Just remember, the court of public opinion changes faster than the law." "And sometimes," she said, "that's how the law changes." Outside the studio, the night air felt electric. Reporters swarmed the exit. Camera flashes burst like fireworks. Microphones thrust forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect that exchange to go viral? Do you think you embarrassed the professor? Is this your breakout moment in national politics?" She paused at the steps, looked out over the chaos of lights and voices, and said simply, "I didn't come to win an argument. I came to make a point. The people watching at home, they're the ones who deserve the last word." Then she moved through the crowd, slipping into her waiting car. The door shut. Silence. Her phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from her chief of staff. "CNN just confirmed, highest-rated debate episode of the year. You're booked for morning edition tomorrow." Crockett smiled faintly, setting the phone face down on the seat. Outside, the city lights blurred past the tinted glass. She leaned back, exhaustion giving way to reflection. What had happened tonight wasn't just a debate. It was a shift. A generational handoff. The old guard defending theory. The new guard defending experience. For the first time in decades, a young congresswoman from Texas had stood toe-to-toe with one of the most revered legal minds in America, and hadn't just survived. She'd won the room, the internet, and perhaps something larger, the right to redefine the conversation. Across town, in a quiet hotel suite, Alan Dershowitz sat alone at his desk. The papers that had once felt like weapons now lay scattered and useless. On the muted television, clips of the debate replayed again and again. He watched himself fumble, watched her steady, watched the crowd erupt at her words. For a long time he didn't move. Then slowly he turned off the TV and stared out the window at the city below. "Maybe," he murmured, "she's what the Constitution looks like now." The words hung in the air, heavy with reluctant respect. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Crockett schools Dershowitz on live TV. Old guard meets new fire. The debate that redefined constitutional conversation. Clips flooded social feeds. Late-night hosts replayed her closing line like a rallying cry. Politicians across party lines weighed in. Some mocked her passion, others praised her precision. But what no one could deny was that something had changed. In Washington, her office phone rang nonstop. Invitations poured in, interviews, panels, endorsements. Her staff worked through the night to manage the flood. Still, when asked how she felt, she answered the same way every time. "It's not about me. It's about the people who finally saw themselves in the debate." A week later, the two met again, this time at a legal symposium at Georgetown University. No cameras, no bright lights, no studio audience, just quiet halls and polished wood. When Crockett entered the room, Dershowitz stood. "Congresswoman," he said, "that was quite a performance last week." "It wasn't a performance," she replied gently. "It was perspective." He nodded slowly. "You were right about one thing. The law does evolve. I may not agree with all your interpretations, but I can't deny your command of the argument." "Appreciate that," she said. "For what it's worth, I learned from you, even when we disagree." They shook hands again. For a brief moment, the past and the future stood side by side, two different eras bound by the same document. As she walked away, Dershowitz looked after her, a thoughtful smile flickering across his face. "She's going to change this place," he muttered to himself, one clause at a time. Later that night, alone in her office, Jasmine Crockett watched the city skyline glow. Her staff had gone home. The Capitol dome gleamed in the distance, a symbol of everything she was fighting to make fairer. She pulled out the same folder from the debate, creased edges, yellow highlights, handwritten notes. At the bottom of the first page, she'd scribbled a single line from Thurgood Marshall. "The Constitution does not prohibit change. It demands it," she smiled, closed the folder and whispered to herself, "Let's keep demanding." The city hummed beyond the glass, alive and restless, waiting for what came next. And somewhere, in that restless hum, history had already started to turn.